Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio. You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello, everybody. This is Jay Shapiro. Thanks for listening. Today, I want to discuss a number of topics, including the now available information about how the Vatican both fought efforts to reunite Holocaust orphans with their relatives and urged Pope Pius XII not to protest the Nazi deportation of Italian Jews, and also how the Arab world was strangely quiet in the wake of the United Arab Emirates' announcement of peace with Israel. The Arab street did not explode. It is a strategic victory for both Israel and the UAE. Israel has started on a path toward normalization with an Arab government for only the third time in its history, previously Jordan and Egypt, and is for the first time with a Gulf Arab state. The United Arab Emirates, UAE, cannot have it both ways, however. Reconcile with the Jews and fund excitement at the same time against Jews. At the same time, UAE pours $51 million per year with no strings attached into the UN Relief and Works Agency budget. That makes the UAE the fifth largest contributor to UNRWA in the world and the largest donor to UNRWA among the Arab nations. Indeed, the UAE has quadrupled its donation. In 2017, it donated $12 million, and now it's doubled its donation. The UAE is fully aware of how the money is used. 54% of the allocations to finance a new school system in the Palestinian Authority, which invokes the right to return by force of arms. So unlike their leaders, the Palestinians living in Syria and Iraq do not appear to be worried about the Israel-UAE Accord. These Palestinians have more existential concerns, such as providing shelter for their children and safe drinking water for their families. They're disturbed about the homes they lost. I'll talk about this and a few other topics. Again, thanks for listening.
G'day, I'm Jono Vandor.
And I'm Ross Nichols.
Join us on our program, Israel on My Mind, a show that broadcasts all the weekly goodness that flows like milk and honey from the Holy Land straight into your ears with humorous and happy news stories.
New shows are posted every Thursday at 7 p.m. Israel time, highlighting the lighter side and advancing a positive view of Israel here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Hello again. I want to touch upon two topics that really deserve in-depth analysis, but I will touch upon them lightly because they're important, and I want to share my thoughts with the listeners. Since Israel's establishment in 1948, it has endured hostility and isolation from most of its neighbors and the entire region. And whilst deals were made with Egypt and Jordan decades ago, it is important to remember the Middle East is a complex neighborhood with many internal struggles, and any interaction that included Israel has experienced much backlash. These are the facts on the ground, and that's the way it is. Now, Prime Minister Netanyahu after announcing the deal with the United Arab Emirates, initiated a media blitz with the help of his ministers, his supporters, and ads in the newspapers suggesting the agreement with the United Arab Emirates, UAE, fits the formula of peace for peace. I do not believe that this is true. The sole novelty is that the Emirates decided not to wait for a solution to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and decided to normalize relations with the Jewish state. The formula remains as it was with Egypt, Jordan, and in some ways with Gaza, land for peace. And Netanyahu said the agreement with the Emirates became possible only after Israel canceled its planned annexation of the Jordan Valley, which it could have done on the 1st of July. The American and Emirati spokesman repeated that publicly. In other words, the cancellation of the annexation permitted the deal. The deal was made possible in part by Israel compromising on land. The only formula which that reflects is land for peace, not peace for peace. It reminds us that in a secret meeting just days after the Six-Day War back in 1967, the government of Israel proposed a formula of land for peace. All the territories captured except Jerusalem would be given back for an authentic peace. It was the Khartoum Arab Summit in November 1967 from which the three no's emerged that delivered the end to Israel's proposal. No recognition, no negotiations, and no peace with Israel. The formula of peace for peace, which Netanyahu is talking about, is therefore misleading. The deal struck with the UAE is important on its own value. There is no need to invent formulas to justify it. The Emirates will not change their attitude toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and they will continue to support the Palestinian claim. It is unclear why Netanyahu is adopting the peace for peace formula publicly at this particular moment. It is irrelevant for the deal with the Emirates, so I guess it is for local consumption. Israel's cancellation of annexing the Jordan Valley for normal relations with additional Arab countries could be in the offing. It may be a formula for future deals with other Arab countries. It is not peace for peace. The very fact that Israel did not annex the Jordan Valley when it could have essentially meant that it was land for peace. And these are the facts on the ground, no matter how you want to butter it up, in other words. Now, along these same lines, I want to say something about Morocco. I visited there with my wife last year. It's a very nice, pleasant place. The reason I bring it up now is Morocco is part of the Arab world, and the Arab world was strangely quiet in the wake of the announcement of peace with Israel by the United Arab Emirates. It's a strange victory for both Israel and the UAE. Israel, as I said, had started on a path toward normalization with an Arab government for only the third time in its history. What they had with Jordan, they had with Egypt. And it's the first time, however, with a Gulf state. The Emirates had positioned itself as a beacon of religious tolerance. There is, for example, a Chabad house in the Emirates. It also strengthens security for the whole Middle East as it increases the pressure on Iran and its proxy Lebanon. Iran's public announcement certainly tried to provoke the proverbial Arab street into protests and demonstrations when the UAE and Israel announced their agreement. So far, this has not occurred. U.S. President Donald Trump's Middle East advisor, Jared Kushner, hailed the UAE-Israel pact as an icebreaker. icebreaker. In a sense, he's quite right. Far from the region, Morocco's prime minister criticized the peace deal. What happened next is really significant. Days later, he walked back his remarks, saying he was speaking in his personal capacity, not as a government official. And this was a clarification, which in itself is rather telling. Many Arabs and Jews remember Morocco's uniquely positive history with Israel. The former king, Hassan II, worked tirelessly to force the rapprochement between Israel and its Arab neighbors, including the Palestinians. He did this privately as well as publicly. He facilitated every major initiative from Camp David in the 1970s to the Oslo agreements in the 1990s. Behind the scenes, King Hassan II was considered a driving force for the first peace agreements between Arabs and Israel. In the years before the 1967 war between Israel and its Arab neighbors, just as pan-Arab calls to annihilate Israel were reaching a fever pitch, Hassan II of Morocco publicly called for Israel's integration into the Arab League. Decades of tragedy and squandered opportunities later, the current king, Mohammed VI, maintains the same commitment to advancing Israeli-Arab rapprochement. The king personally provides funds for humanitarian and medical aid to the Palestinians. In these and other efforts, he is affirming that the Palestinian people's human needs should be met. But he's also signaling that their future lies not in the triumphs or failings of any official leadership, but in the development of their own peaceful civil society. He supports that. By the way, there are also family ties between Israel and Morocco. 1 million Israelis were either natives of Morocco or have a Moroccan-born parent or grandparent. The legal rights of Jews and other religious minorities are guaranteed in Morocco's constitution that was written in 2011. Jewish schools still dot Morocco's major cities, and Jews worship freely there. When I was in Morocco, I prayed at a synagogue right in the heart of the capital. Above all, the king has made his personal affinity for Jews into formal domestic policy and won over a large swath of the population to the values of religious tolerance that he himself espouses. And as I said, we visited there, and we went to the synagogue in Casablanca, a beautiful little synagogue. I don't know if there are synagogues in other places. I don't know if there are Jews in other places. But in Casablanca, there is a Jewish population, and as I said, a very beautiful little synagogue right in the heart of town. There are no guards outside. There's no, apparently, at least not visibly. So I think the Jews feel quite comfortable there. So I just wanted to touch upon this, what I was saying, that there, so far the agreement with the UAE is not peace for peace. The truth of the matter is that so far it is land for peace, and perhaps this will be the same formula that will be used to make agreements with other Arab countries, and perhaps even other Muslim countries. Right now, the big fear of these Sunni countries is Iran, and which is a Shiite country, and also Turkey has been rather unfriendly here in the Middle East, not only to Israel, but to other Muslim countries. So we live in a part of the world where there is never a dull moment. So the fact there is an agreement with the UAE is really a major step forward, and we'll have to see how it develops. You can't necessarily draw conclusions from it. But again, considering the way the situation has been since the establishment of the State of Israel, this is really a major step forward. As I said, we had agreements with Jordan, we had agreements with Egypt, both of which we border On the other hand, the UAE does not border Israel, but they see advantage in having a treaty with Israel. And again, they made one of the conditions that we do not annex the Jordan Valley. So that has to be kept in mind. So it's a step forward. Hopefully it will lead to other steps. I'll be back after the break.
Hi everyone, this is Andrea Simento from Jerusalem, inviting you to drop everything and join me on my show, Pull Up a Chair. We'll visit this week's quirky stories, meet fabulous guests, and discover my Israel. Together we'll laugh, shout, and explain the topics that make us say, hey, we've got to talk about that. So get comfortable and pull up a chair with me, Andrea Simento, every Thursday on Israel News Talk Radio.
Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. Did you know this psalm and many others were composed by a Jewish shepherd and musician who later became a king? Would you like to know some of the inner meanings of psalms to help you connect with God and strengthen your soul? An exciting and easy-to-read book is now available which will help you do just that. Software for the Soul, Psalms for Everyone, available on Kindle, Audible, and Amazon.com. Software for the Soul.
Modesty at the beach? It isn't just about body image. It's about feeling good. Modest swimsuits, so we don't get burned by the sun.
So we won't get ogled by strangers.
So we'll feel free to express ourselves without the need to expose ourselves.
Let Marcy Modest help you to cover up what you want, how you want.
Made in Israel.
Visit marcymodest.com. That's MARSEA modest.com.
And get a 10% discount on your first purchase.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
Jay Shapiro. I want to say a few words about the real Palestinian tragedy. And I'm not talking about the Palestinian Arabs who live under Israel. I'm talking about the Palestinians who live in Syria and Iraq, and they do not appear to be worried about the accord that Israel made with the United Arab Emirates. The Palestinians living in Syria and Iraq have more existential concerns, such as providing shelter for their children and safe drinking water for their families. They're disturbed about the homes they've lost, and they're in a state of anguish about the fate of their missing sons. In Syria, since the beginning of the civil war back in 2011, more than 4,000 Palestinians have been killed and thousands wounded. Tens of thousands of others have fled their homes, some to other areas in Syria, and others to neighboring Arab countries and also to Europe. By contrast, by the way, the UAE, the country that made an agreement now with Israel, and other Gulf states have long opened their doors to Palestinians and provided them with jobs and high living standards. The Palestinian leaders have plenty of time to castigate the UAE for making an agreement for Israel, but no time at all to comment on the systematic abuse and killing of Palestinians in Syria and in Iraq. For the Palestinian Authority and for Hamas also, the true tragedy is when an Arab expresses willingness to make peace with Israel. They consider this a tragedy. Palestinian leaders are so committed to condemning the UAE for its normalization agreement with Israel, they have no time left to notice the horrific suffering of their own people in some Arab countries, particularly Syria and Iraq. Specifically, the leaders, the Palestinian leaders, seem unperturbed that in some Arab countries Palestinians are starving and some are mysteriously disappearing. Unlike their leaders, however, Palestinians living in Syria and Iraq do not appear to be worried about the Israel-UAE accord. As I said, they have more existential problems. In the past 3 weeks, leaders of the Palestinian Authority and Hamas have focused their attention mainly on the Israel-UAE deal and how to persuade other Arab states from following in the footsteps of the UAE. Peace between Israel and the UAE, nevertheless, seems to be the last thing on the mind of the Palestinians who actually live in Syria. As I said, since the beginning of the civil war, more than 4,000 Palestinians have have been killed, and thousands wounded. Tens of thousands of others have lost their homes. Some have left to go to other areas in Syria, and they live under really poor conditions. While Palestinians living in what they call the West Bank, in Judea and Samaria and the Gaza Strip, at the request of their leaders, are burning flags of the UAE for the last couple of weeks. Hundreds of displaced Palestinian families were living in dire humanitarian conditions in tents in northern Syria and under very bad conditions. There's an organization called the Action Group for Palestinians of Syria, and they keep track as best as they can on what's happening to those families living in Syria. And they've reported that many of the families were forced to flee to tents because of the lack of basic services. They have intense summer heat, lack of water, and sometimes the camps lack water for many days at a time. Many Palestinians, including women, are missing in Syria since the beginning of the civil war. The conditions of Palestinians in Iraq are also bad, even if not as bad as the ones living in Syria. In Iraq, too, Palestinians seem to be disappearing in mysterious circumstances. The last 2 weeks ago, several Palestinian families living in Iraq appealed to the Iraqi prime minister to reveal the fate of their sons, who have been detained for many years without anyone knowing their place of detention or the circumstances of their incarceration. Some of them have been in detention. According to Palestinian authorities, some have been in detention since 2005. And this, I'm quoting what these Palestinian authorities says. I'm not making this up. They've turned to the International Committee of the Red Cross and other organizations, including the United Nations, but both the United Nations and the International Red Cross have refused to assist the Palestinians in their search for their family members. And I have on my desk, I have a list of all kind of comments by Palestinian residents of Iraq and of Syria and their complaints. They mention their names. They're not afraid to mention their names because they want to know what happened to their kids. So, considering the popularity of the Palestinian cause, it's somewhat surprising that the plight of Palestinian refugees in Iraq and Syria also is severely underreported. There is a Qatar-funded website called The New Arab, from which I got a lot of this information. They wrote, and I quote, "After suffering more than a decade and a half of abuses, Palestinians who have been living in Iraq since the creation of Israel in 1948 are now seeking to leave their adoptive home to escape the torments that they suffer on a daily basis." The New Arab report pointed out Palestinians denied identity cards and they've been denied travel documents. So it's interesting because they've been accused in Iraq of being loyalist to Saddam Hussein, who was once the dictator. The Palestinian leaders who are now accusing the UAE that made an agreement with Israel, they're accusing them of stabbing the Palestinians in the back because it seeks to make peace with Israel. Truth of the matter is, they might take note that Arab countries such as Iraq and Syria are not only stabbing the Palestinians in the back, but actually killing and wounding them and starving them, forcing them out of their homes, and making their sons disappear. By contrast, extreme contrast, the UAE that made an agreement with Israel and other Gulf states have long opened their doors to Palestinians and provided them with jobs and high living standards. This I get from the New Arab Report. I'm not making this up. Presently, Palestinian leaders have plenty of time to castigate the UAE for making some kind of a peace treaty with Israel, while at the same time they're suffering in Syria and Iraq, as the UAE is actually helping individuals. So it appears that Palestinians in Syria and Iraq will continue to fear for their lives so long as their leaders prefer to derail peace agreements between Israel and Arab countries rather than to really complain against the persecution and killing of Palestinians in Arab states. That is what's actually happening. Now, I want to change the subject in the last few minutes of this portion of my program. I really changed the subject, but something I want to touch upon. A totally different subject, but I want to share with the listeners. There is a gentleman named David Kurtzer. He's at the Brown University historian, and he published the results of his investigation into Vatican documents unsealed in March. He did this in an article published in the Atlantic magazine 2 weeks ago. He revisited the high-profile story of Jewish twins who were kidnapped and baptized by the French Catholic priests. And also, he noted that the Vatican both fought efforts to reunite two Holocaust orphans with their relatives and urged Pope Pius XII not to protest the Nazi deportation of Italian Jews. This is according to a Brown University historian, David Kurtzer. The Pope Pius XII has long been accused of turning a blind eye to the Holocaust, which happened early on in his stint of nearly 20 years as Pope. Keep in mind that he was the Vatican diplomat representing the Vatican in Nazi Germany when Hitler came to power. So now we have more evidence by a historian that the Pope was advised to speak privately with the German ambassador about the roundup, recommending to the Germans that the already grave situation with Jews not be aggravated further. But he asked the Pope not to protest the move publicly, and indeed he did not. So that's a historic fact. I just wanted to share it with the listeners without any further comment. I'll be back after the break.
Are you interested in transforming your life, drawing closer to the Creator, and uncovering the deeper meanings and hidden treasures in the Hebrew Bible?
Then join me, Rav Yitzhak Michelson,
and me, William Hall,
on the Science of Kabbalah, where we are seeking to narrow the gap between what we understand of our physical and spiritual worlds. So make sure to tune in every Tuesday at 5 p.m. Israel time, 10 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, here on Israel News Talk Radio.
You're listening to The Jay Shapiro Show.
You're back with Jay Shapiro, and I want to say a few more words about the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates, known as the UAE. I've given it some more thought. It's several weeks ago, it's almost 3 weeks since the agreement was made public. You have to keep in mind that no major wars have been held between Israel and any of the 21 Arab League member states for nearly half a century, and no minor ones in nearly 40 years. There wasn't much of an Arab-Israeli conflict left, but with the exception of Egypt and Jordan, which normalized relations years ago, and they did it in return for American military aid and economic subsidies. Except for that, the Arab world has remained united in rejecting diplomatic recognition of Israel until it withdrew from the territories captured during the 1967 war. This was a quid pro quo sanctioned by the Arab League back in 2002. So conventional wisdom held that Israel's occupation of the Palestinian inhabited area called the West Bank and Gaza was such an affront to Arabs everywhere that normalizing relations with the Jewish state would entail too high a political price for any Arab government to contemplate. Now, the Israeli-UAE agreement and the regional reaction to it underscores that the fate of the Palestinians is no longer a political concern for the Arab regimes. This is partly because it is no longer a concern of their subjects. There is a gentleman named James Zogby who does polling, and he conducted regular surveys of public opinion in major Arab countries. And the latest survey in September of 2009 revealed that there has been a sea of change in attitudes toward the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which ranked in the bottom tier of priorities in every country. In other words, in every Arab country, they really don't care about the conflict between the Palestinians and Israel. Now, that's not to say that the Arabs don't sympathize with the Palestinian predicament or they view Israel with distaste. They're just doing something that isn't high on the wish list of what ordinary citizens want from their rulers in the Arab countries and in the Muslim countries. During the 2011 Arab Spring, anti-Israel slogans were very scarce, and all the mass demonstrations that brought down Hosni Mubarak in Egypt and the Al-Abidin Ben Ali in Tunis. The insurgents were nearly toppled the Syrian President Assad, ignored the Palestinian cause altogether. And that's true also of the revolutionaries in Libya who kicked out Muammar Gaddafi. Now, what's been revealed in recent years is they don't really care so much in the Arab nations about the fate of the Palestinians. They talk about the Palestinians being dear to their hearts, but that's only lip service. The only Arab Islamists presently engaged in the fight against Israel are those who derive patronage from actors outside the Arab world, primarily Iran, and they operate in failed state environments where the patronage can really be turned into economic power. For example, Hamas and Hezbollah, they get money from Iran and apparently also from Turkey. So the popular hostility to Israel in the Arab world is strong enough that, all else being equal, few of the rulers will be inclined to normalize relations with Israel where there are not increasingly much to gain. For many Arab states, the strategic benefits of cooperation with Israel have vastly increased particularly because of the rising threat by Iran and Turkey, and also that the Americans are disengaging from the Middle East under Trump. The Obama administration's accommodation of Iran's nuclear ambitions and refusal to act forcefully against Iranian aggression in Syria led to widespread recognition that Arab regimes on their own in confronting Iran's bid for regional hegemony. For all of the Trump administration's anti-Iranian bluster, its disengagement from Syria and the weak response to Iranian provocation in the Persian Gulf last year made many pro-American Arab governments feel very much that they are being left in the lurch. In other words, the fear of Iran and the fear of Turkey is what's prominent in the minds of many Arab regimes here in the Middle East. They're worried more about their own necks than they are about what happens to the Palestinians. Apparently, there's been a lot of secret security cooperation between Arab leaders in Israel for many years, and eventually much of it may result in diplomatic normalization. An expert on this area explained these hitherto furtive alignments with Israel became a much more convincing deterrent against Iran if Arab and Israeli leaders actually seen together in public occasionally. Now, the UAE has broken the Arab taboo against normalization with Israel. Other Arab states may be inclined to do so in ways consistent with their own interests. Their own interest is what would bring them together with Israel. There are some, for example, like Syria and the Houthi-ruled Yemen, they will remain openly hostile to Israel. Most will run the gamut between these extremes. As the remaining 19 Arab League member states reach various degrees of accommodation with Israel, which may happen, at least some of the world's 12 non-Arab states who don't recognize Israel, 9 of which are majority Muslim, they'll reassess their boycott of Israel. So, how the collapse of Arab solidarity against Israel will affect the pursuit of a two-state solution between Israel and the Palestinians is something that one could debate. The Michael Oren, who was the Israeli ambassador to the United States for about 5 years, he claimed that Israel would be more likely to make concessions if it is secure in its newfound relations with the Arab world. That may or may not be true. It's not inconceivable that all kinds of Israel's newfound relations will increase the willingness of Palestinian leaders to accept the legitimacy of Israel and drop their demand for the so-called right of return, which, by the way, I don't think they can do because that is their reason for existence, the right of return. That's what they claim. The most likely scenario, however, is that Palestinian leaders continue on the rejectionist path and they'll be supported with Iran, Turkey, and the militantly anti-Zionist global left. Anti-Semitism, Islamic supremacism, and Islamic authoritarianism will continue to make the world a dangerous place for the only Jewish state. Even if the Arab-Israeli conflict simmers down and essentially to a certain degree will go out of existence. What the Arab states and the Muslim states are interested in is their own survival. And as long as the Sunni Arab nations see Iran as a possible hostile enemy, and the same thing with Turkey, they are going to look around for allies who will help them. And that only one in the Middle East who is really capable of helping them both in new inventions and developments and things of that nature is Israel. So therefore, their friendship with Israel, which could become really warm, is based, as I understand it, primarily on their own desire or the desire of their leaders to keep their heads attached to the rest of their bodies. So it's not so much love of Israel, but it's the fact that their own self-interest is what motivates them. And if good can come out of that by a warming of relations with Israel, that's all for the better. This is what it's like in the Middle East. It's very difficult to know, even 5 minutes from now, who will be friendly with whom. But so far, things in the last couple of years, in particular the last couple months, have been moving toward warmer relations between Israel and its neighbors. Thanks again for listening.
If you love Israel News Talk Radio, then you'll love our Facebook page. We keep you up to date on what's happening in Israel, plus little surprise treasures that we don't share on the radio. Go now to follow us on Facebook. Just look for the Israel News Talk Radio Facebook page, and don't forget to subscribe and follow us by clicking on the like button. We post great stuff there that you'll want to share. Israel News Talk Radio on Facebook and Israel News Radio on Twitter.
If you're hearing this message, everyone else can too. Advertise with Israel News Talk Radio and get your message out to people. We'll build a personalized package for you. Contact advertising at israelnewstalkradio.com.
Straight talk from Israel. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
Hey, this is Jake in Anchorage, Alaska, and I love listening to all the super interesting interviews and up-to-date information on what's happening in Israel.
Hello, this is Anna King, originally from London, now living in Israel. And what can I say? Israel News Talk Radio is my cup of tea.
My name is Bhaskar. I'm from India, and I love listening because you get to know the truth and wonderful voices from this lovely country.
Mom! Okay, wait a minute. Hi, this is Chava Dax, and I'm calling from the rolling hills of Ma'ale Adumim, just north of Jerusalem. I always listen to Israel News Talk Radio to get all the latest news and commentary and to keep me up to date every day.
This is Sarah Dax from Ma'ale Adumim, and I'm 12. I wish Israel News Talk Radio was boring so my mom wouldn't listen to it all the time. Mom!
You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.
News, opinion, and more. You're listening to Israel News Talk Radio.